Welcome to the 32nd episode of the Tokyo Alumni podcast. Today, our guest was born in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. She was raised in Tokyo, where she attended the American school in Japan from kindergarten all the way to graduation. Upon graduating in 2006, she attended Boston University's College of Communication to pursue a bachelor's degree in journalism and spent her formative years after graduation producing documentaries at a production company. She then earned her master's degree at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism and began working for the Washington D.C.'s Bureau of Japan's largest newspaper, the Yomiuri Shimbun. After covering the 2016 presidential election, she moved on to work as a producer at On Point, a daily news show on Boston's NPR station, and currently produces short documentaries and podcasts for a Washington-based defense think tank. Most recently, she hosted a 4-part TV docuseries called Deciphering Japan, which explores hot-button issues that have both galvanized and polarized the nation. She interviews the people at the forefront of change in Japan. Welcome to the podcast, Yumi.
Thanks for having me, Nikki.
So today we'll look at becoming a journalist, you being sort of the super podcast host, producer. How many podcasts do you
I think at this point, 22 or something like that. Yeah.
So too many.
Yep.
A lot of podcasts. And of course, most recently, and there'll be a little link to the docuseries to both the YouTube and the website where you go back to Japan, as a journalist and investigate various issues from, the aging population to being a woman in Japan to overwork and identity. So let's sort of go back to the roots. Journalism major, I know almost of none in regards to graduates from ASIJ or the international schools. So why did you choose this route as a career path?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a seminal moment for me was 9/11. I was in 7th grade when that happened. And I recall trying to read a bunch of stories about what happened and not really getting a great answer. Of course, we understood that the Twin Towers were attacked, the Pentagon was attacked. But beyond that, in terms of the larger national security sort of picture, the Bush administration was saying, well, all of this is terrible, and now we have to go in and investigate weapons of mass destruction, et cetera. And I remember at the time kind of being like, what exactly is happening here? Does the administration actually know that weapons of mass destruction exist? How does this one incident unfold into this really escalatory, national security situation? And that had always confused and fascinated me. And, it was really the journalism around 9/11 that spoke a lot to me about the lessons of the importance of keeping alive historical records. So journalism is often referred to as, the first draft of history. And, seeing a lot of the reporting around 9/11, a lot of it was really good. And a lot of it was just really terrible, or at least confused. And the sources were, just not sort of verified. This has real consequences to people's lives, right? So that aspect of it really intrigued me. Also, incidentally, I don't remember how long after that, but we had career day. Maybe it was in 8th grade. And I remember one of my classmates' father, Mark Schilling, he's a movie critic for the Japan Times and some other papers. But he came in, and I remember hearing him talk about, working for a newspaper and just being really enamored by that and drawn to that, and to be able to be in a career where you hold the responsibility of helping to shape public opinion or helping to help the public understand like what's going on. That had always been something that was really I was drawn to that, and so really from 7th grade or 8th grade onwards, I knew I wanted to be a journalist.
Wow, that is really early in the game to want to know what you want to do. When you actually, decided to sort of officially be a journalism major, was there ever any pushback from people at your parents or other people? Because, journalism, I think one of the reasons why people don't go into it, like a lot of people don't go into teaching, is that it's not necessarily associated with a lot of money, right? It's not the most financially rewarding industries. So what was that ever, was there ever a pushback basically from other people that to not go into journalism for those reasons?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when I entered journalism, or at least entered to study journalism, the industry was just beginning to realize that its financial models were not working very well, and that, the job security in that industry wasn't going to be as good as it was, in the golden ages of, the 60s onwards, essentially. So that with the background, I myself didn't really have a whole lot of worry going into it in that sense. Also, I come from a fairly unstereotypical Japanese family in that, like, both of my parents are musicians, or my mom's a music instructor, but they're both in the music world and talk about professions that don't pay all that much. So I think for them it was like, well, journalism, that's not music. I mean, that must pay at least a bit more than music. But also, strangely, I mean, I don't come from a very wealthy family, but money was never a concern. I think my family was always invested in me and wanted me to do whatever I was passionate about. I think where I began to realize, like, yeah, journalism, a lot more is required of you, and, maybe you might not get paid so much. Really, that revelation came like my junior and senior year, and that's when I really sort of buckled down and so I was pursuing print journalism. I always wanted to be like a Time magazine writer, for example. Sort of observing the world around me, I realized I'm not going to make it if I'm just going to have print skills. I need to learn how to do video. I need to learn how to do audio. So, in junior year, I think I made it a pretty concerted effort to try to delve into multimedia and equip myself, especially because I was an international student and, I was going to be on an OPT and I wasn't going to be guaranteed, or I couldn't just, look for a job for a long time, right? Like, I needed to get a job 90 days after graduation or else my visa would expire. So, I just went into it full throttle with multimedia. And I think, that was one of the best decisions that I've made in my career, because you have to be nimble and sort of multifaceted and a Jill of all trades these days to really get a wide scope. If you're just aiming to work at the New Yorker, like, good luck. Like, that's going to happen to a very few people. So, you have to make yourself marketable in other realms.
That's really interesting when you talk about the evolution and sort of changes in regards to media. Even myself personally, there's those paywalls, and for a while I was always sort of resisting. I would just wait for the next month, because usually it was like max 3 articles, but now I'm starting to pay for it. Do you think, in that sense, are we going to see, we mentioned in the intro a bit about Yomiuri Shimbun, hard copy newspapers? We know they're decreasing, but during our lifetime, do you think they're going to be completely ridden of?
That's an interesting question too, because I think the answer depends on what country you're talking about. I can only speak about Japanese broadsheet newspapers and American papers. So if we start off with, the American news industry, I think a lot of it is going to be increasingly more and more digital. I don't think that within our lifetimes, newspaper, like actual tactile paper subscriptions, are going to go away completely. But I suspect that those subscriptions are going to be in the province of the elite readership. Maybe universities will have to them and things like that. But everyday people, I think more and more just go, opting for that digital option. Japan is an interesting information market, and I haven't fully been able to like wrap my head around it. But having worked for Yomiuri Shimbun, right, like, Yomiuri Shimbun currently maintains still the world's largest circulation. It's like 9 million or something, or maybe it's like 8.5 at this point. But still, like, people are continue to be wedded to their newspapers. And I'm always shocked at how people consume news in Japan. And it's not necessarily digital first. Again, I haven't quite fully understood like why that is. And I'm wondering if any alumni have like worked on research on that, because I'd love to read about it. But so in that sense, you know, in Japan, like I think, you know, the newspaper is still very much king, although with the pricing and, you know, the economy being not so great in Japan, like I have to wonder how many young folks are opting for subscriptions. I think, you know, traditionally it used to be, oh, my family is an Asahi family, or my family is a Yomiuri family, and that's just what we got. And, you know, that's why my family now subscribes to it. I don't know if that model is continuing, but all that to say, you know, I still think newspapers are going to be there because at the end of the day, you know, you're, again, harkening back to the, you know, journalism is the first draft of history. We can archive things on the internet and things like that, but insofar as there might be, you know, a hack or whatever, and all the data might go away one day, right? I mean, that's very unlikely to happen. But I think from a historical perspective, that paper aspect of it is still very much an important part of the industry's soul. So I think it'll stay.
That's an interesting point. At least from a school perspective, we thought, some of us thought 10, 20 years ago that Kindle would probably take over by now, but it seems like paperback books are still going pretty strong, at least within the K through 12 education. So it'll be interesting to see though, with a lot of elementary schools have, you know, iPads now. So, you know, especially with movements towards a more sustainable sort of world, how much of a shift we'll see in regards to that front as well. You graduate BU, you get the job, you've been working, and at what point did you start to get involved with the podcast game? And also, you mentioned earlier sort of this importance of being multifaceted. Is that something common among other people who pursue journalism right now, to be basically adept at various skills beyond just writing? Because to be honest, until we had this conversation today, that was sort of my impression of a journalist, was like someone who writes.
Yeah. You know, I didn't get into podcasting until I worked at a radio station. And, you know, basically I was producing a daily live 2-hour news show every day. And, you know, that's slightly different from the world of podcasting, but it's still, you know, the medium of audio. And, you know, that job really trained me to deal with that medium. And first and foremost, writing for sound is very different from writing for print. And so that's sort of like the foremost lesson that I learned there. And, you know, the technical stuff, like how to record, that's stuff you always just pick up on the job. But what you have to learn, I think, at a newsroom is the writing and the content part of it. And so, you know, I didn't necessarily feel handicapped or ill-equipped. You know, it's like, oh, I've never worked in radio before. But like at the end of the day, it's all news telling, right? It's just about like the different modes and mediums of being able to do that. And so when I left that position and went to go work for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where I currently work, I wanted to try some things out on my own, because, you know, I was working for a show at WBUR, the NPR station, but I wanted to kind of implement some of those things that I've learned into a new space. And the center where I currently work had podcasts that they had sort of started podcasting, but in a way that I thought lacked a little bit of dynamism. And I just thought, like, let me just suggest like having some intro music, or, you know, instead of recording your interview and reading the description of the person up front, maybe like read it later and just reinsert it later, or, you know, just these little things. And from there, my responsibilities kind of grew, and now I manage 22 of them. But, you know, it's really through doing that you gain that experience. And I'm also a borderline obsessive listener of podcasts. So that's actually also where I pick up a lot of my podcasting skills as it pertains to, you know, like soundscapes and, you know, how to insert music in well and things like that. But, you know, all that to say, it's really through doing that I became, you know, kind of adept adept at it. And that, kind of dovetails into your question of, is this common for journalists? When I was even in graduate school at Columbia, they were still sort of pushing, you're first and foremost like a print journalist. And I kept being like, well, okay, if my capstone or my final project is to write a 10,000 word piece, can I instead do an 8,000 word piece and accompany it with like a 5-minute video? Because I can do that. And I think that's like just, more the way the world is going. And I'm surprised when I look at jobs now, still, I think it's fairly siloed in skill set. But I think increasingly, it's just more advantageous for you when you're looking for jobs and you know how to do more than one different type of journalism. Because if you're only, if your only experience is in print, you only can look for print jobs. But more and more, I think some jobs are also like, it would be preferable if you knew some video or if you knew a little bit of audio editing or something like that. I happen to work at it's called the Ideas Lab at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, but we actively search for multimedia producers, so people who have done multiple different mediums. And I think more and more of that is happening, but I think journalism schools and the industry still has to catch up in that way.
Do you think there's sort of been this enigmatic rise of podcast listeners? And I say that because at least the sort of vision that we've been sold in regards to millennials, as well as I guess Gen Zs are adults now, the oldest Gen Zs, is they have short attention spans, or they have TikTok and whatever, short. But then all of a sudden you have these like 2-hour podcasts like that are getting more and more people listening. How much of do you think media is adapting to the demographics, the upcoming demographics, and how much of it is it media who's actually shaping what people should read?
I think everything is a little bit of push and pull, give and take, a little bit of column A, column B. But ultimately, the way that I would answer that is it's been proven that people go to where good content is, no matter what the length or size or bit size. So, I think for millennials anyway, there's a lot of research that proves that we will buy subscriptions to things, even if they are expensive. But if we know that, whether it's New York Times or whether it's the New Republic or, Talking Points Memo or smaller sort of Slate type blogs or something like that, whatever the medium, if you find it compelling, you will pay for it. And you'll usually skip over just aggregated crap that's out there. Same for, something like TikTok. Yes, it happens to be a very bite-sized medium, but people flock to it because it's good content. Some of the most viral content that goes around these days is from TikTok. I guess the way to describe it also is, like, if you take Quibi, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with Quibi, but it's essentially this, platform for videos and video storytelling where, the stories are supposed to be bite-sized, like 6 minutes long. It sounded like something that was generated from the belief that younger consumers are more likely to take to shorter things. But we've come to understand that Quibi is not doing so well. They're laying off a bunch of people. They put a lot of money into this and it's just not working. And I think that's a result, not necessarily because people don't like 6-minute things, but it doesn't fit into our world anymore, right? It was supposed to be the accompaniment to your commute. It was supposed to be something that you did during a lunch break at work or something. We don't have commutes anymore in COVID, right? We don't, necessarily want something that's 6 minutes long. It's an awkward sort of length to fit in our post-COVID lifestyles. So, all that to say, I think it just depends, and people just, again, flock to where good content is, no matter what the medium or the length of digestible size it is.
Interesting. Yeah. The point of Quibi is definitely, it'll be interesting to see how it evolves in the next few months. Because I think they had a 3-month free subscription or something like that. And I heard that just expired. So of course, a lot of people aren't updating their subscription. So it seems like they're going to be in some trying times, especially as you said, no commute means people don't care, about 5-minute videos. They're already home.
Right.
I want to jump a bit into the docu-series. So, what your most fresh, sort of most recent project, where you examine, I believe there's 4 episodes, right, that examine the aging population, being a woman in Japan, identity, the concept of identity in Japan, and the work-life balance, or basically the work ethic they have there. And had a few questions in regards to these docuseries. So the first one is, when you returned to Japan, what did you find most sort of as a reverse culture shock?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think my answer is going to be really relevant to this podcast because it, deals with sort of internationalism. But, when you and I were, in school in ASIJ, like if you went to a konbini, right, convenience store, it's likely that the teller or the person helping out would be Japanese. I was shocked at the number of immigrants who are now in Japan, whether it's the guy helping you get your suitcase off of the limousine bus from Haneda, or, like when I was filming, we were staying in the Asakusabashi area. And, if folks are familiar with that area, there's tons of small izakaya, right? And I went to dinner one night to this okonomiyaki place, and the guy who greeted me was like Pakistani or something, spoke perfect Japanese, and was like, irashaimase, and stuff like that. And I was like, oh my God, that's nuts. And seeing that was really just, I don't know if it's culture shock, but like, Japan used to be so monolithically Japanese. And so it was quite, heartening for me, but also just kind of, I wasn't expecting that at all. I've seen, I've been back to Japan like every year, like once or twice, but, for very limited amounts of time. So for filming Deciphering Japan, I was there for like, 2 months essentially. And it really struck home just how many more immigrants are here and are doing really important jobs.
Yeah, I can totally sort of second that, where I sort of have a unique experience because of the way I look, even though I'm half Japanese. As you mentioned, people from all over the place, but mostly Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia. And they'll often see me. And a lot of these people are trilingual, right? They speak Japanese, they speak the language from the country they're from, which might be English, but usually it's not. And they also speak a little bit English too. There's always a moment of pause, and they kind of go, should I speak to this guy in Japanese or English? But they can speak to me in either, which I've always been like super impressed. They said, or for any job, whether it's in a convenience store or just someone helping me with my bags right as you get off Narita. So you pursue this 4-part series, all very interesting topics. And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I feel like there's a lot of issues, right? Like every country has issues, but what do you think is the most pressing one right now for Japan? And, what are the possible remedies?
Yeah, I think there's 2 ways that I can answer this. And one's going to be the more sort of news lens you answer. And then the other one's going to be a little bit more philosophical. But I think the major problem, there's a lot going on in Japan. That's a problem. But I think, it's hard to distill, but aging, I think, is a lot. And that sort of ties into a lot of the other issues that are happening in Japan. But essentially, with the population in decline, that also stems to and help to understand why the economy is not doing so well, right? When you have most people in retirement, I mean, they're reliant on, what is the equivalent of Social Security to, live their lives. And if the population of working Japanese are not as high, it's hard to sustain that kind of system, right? And it also, sort of dovetails into the question of immigration. And we just discussed that we've seen a lot more foreigners in there, but, most of them are on temporary or short-term visas, right? They're the path towards legal residency or even, nationalization, which very rarely happens, is not common. So, discussions about that comes in, how do we replenish the population? Well, I mean, for me, my personal opinion is that, just immigration, duh. But, there are a lot of politically charged consequences that come with that. So yeah, I think that's from a newsy lens, one of the major issues that stands out to me. One of the more philosophical issues that I think Japan is facing is this notion of trying to find yourself outside of what society or what you have always thought yourself to be at a surface level. So for example, in the work episode, right, we talk a lot about karoshi and how people sort of are working themselves to death. And I think that's part of it is, especially like Japanese salarymen, right? The traditional salaryman is so invested in my identity and my work as a sarariman. I go into the office at 8 or 9 a.m. or sometimes even earlier. I finish my work at 6, 7, or 8, and then I have to go to the nomikai out of giri to with my bosses XYZ. And so they're left with like nothing else outside of that identity to invest in. And, we time and time and again, when I was, filming this, I and interviewing people, I realized that was the case. So not just with Sarariman, but also, as it pertains to women, who am I outside of being a mother or, like a family person? Like I also have aspirations and desires, right? Why can't I fit that into my life as well? As it pertains to older folks, it's a lot like, well, what the hell do I do after retirement? All this time, all I've been doing is just working, and I don't know what to do after this. So that really stuck out to me as well. I don't think this is necessarily like a germane to Japanese identity. I think this is a problem that's occurring all around the world, frankly. And in that way, I found it like really, really universal. And a problem that I think generally the world needs to confront a little bit better.
Interesting. So the aging population, the immigration, and the sort of this work ethic. And I kind of want to sort of tag along an extra question along with work ethic, because it's something I often ponder about. People often revel at where I live in Korea, and there's a lot of parallels with Japan and Korea, a lot. And one is the hours, right? I think in the docuseries I mentioned 1,700 hours for Japanese people a year in comparison to, British are 1,500 and Germans are 1,300. But sort of my qualms with those statistics is, do you feel like in Japan, those hours aren't the most efficient? And if so, why?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of it has to do with giri or, making sure that you don't look like you're leaving early, or, you need to look like you're working hard. It has nothing to do with the actual output, right? And I think, work culture is changing a little bit in Japan, but for the most part, it's still very much based on, does he look like a hard worker? Does he go to the nomikai? Does he suck up to the right people, or she, right? And yeah, I mean, even anecdotally, most of my friends, live and work in the US now from ASIJ, but the ones who did work in Japan always say like, I got my work done like really early, but like I feel really weird about leaving before my boss or whatever it is. I mean, this actually also applied to me when I worked at Yomiuri Shimbun too, right? Like, even though I was in a bureau in the US, my colleagues were mostly Japanese, although there were American reporters as well who were in my position. But I, for some reason, like just never felt like I could go home before them. Or if I was about to I was like packing up, someone might be like, Yumi-san, gomenasai, chotto, and like I'd be like, don't, like, I'm packing up to leave, like I'm done with my day. So yeah, but yeah, of course, like, the amount of work that you put in, or the number of hours, means nothing about the output, and it's evidenced by like looking at Japan's economy, right? It's not doing great. And so like more work does not mean more output.
Yeah, I'm happy you were the one to mention that, because I basically had similar stories that I've heard from other people. Probably the most extreme / funny one I've heard of is if you remember Pokemon Go, was
Yeah.
quite popular at one point in time. Maybe it still is to a certain degree. I had a friend who was working in Japan. He was basically telling me that his day would consist of basically writing emails for about an hour or two, playing Pokemon Go for about 6-7 hours, because he has to be, he has to be around, and then leaving. And I was like, you got to be exaggerating. This was like one day, right? And he was like, no, like, I'm serious. Like, this has been my life last 2 weeks, and I hate it because it's just not fulfilling. So
of course not.
You've read about it. I've probably read about it until, my 20s, but then to actually sort of see how the sausage is really made, firsthand, that was a bit shocking to me because I've been sort of fed this narrative that, Japanese people are hardworking, which they are. But again, it's just it's not efficient. I feel like it's maybe the best word to describe inefficient hard.
Exactly. And like work for the sake of work, not to like actually create or produce anything.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting one. And I think it's sort of, we've touched upon it a bit in regards to identity when you mentioned immigration. So this is sort of a two-part question. Is one, you personally, I'm really curious, as someone who's basically spent half their life in the States and half their life in Japan, how has your identity changed throughout the past few decades? And secondly, do you see the way people in Japan look at people of like basically what's not considered, what we'd say Jun Nihonjin or like Junketsu, right? Pure Japanese. Do you see a shift in perspective in regards to that? And I think you cover this in episode 4, but it hasn't been released yet. So I'm only deducing based upon the preview. So yeah, if you can maybe answer those two-part question.
Yeah, sure. Answer to part 1, how has my identity changed? I love telling this story because it's just so bizarre. But, the entire time that I was at ASIJ, I could not wait to go to America, right? Having had an American education, I loved it. Especially when we were growing up in Japan, the 80s and 90s, not super hospitable to, hafu or, daburu, right, people. So I was like, oh man, I can't wait to get to the US. It's going to be so much better in terms of like equality for people and women. And it's just going to be great. Of course, when I got to the US, things were okay. And, President Obama, who's a liberal president, was, the first African-American president elected. That really gave me a lot of hope. And I was like, this is amazing. But the sort of everyday racism or like microaggressions, the incipient inequality that you can see just by the number of homeless people around, especially in Boston, was genuinely upsetting. And it's really interesting because me moving to the US has really deepened my love for Japan. Because America has become such a foil to Japan for me, right? I mean, not that Japan gets everything right. I don't think that at all. But especially when you look at the past, 4 years, there are things, and even before the last 4 years, right? There were things that were problematic to me, and like just healthcare, right? Like healthcare and the Affordable Care Act was something that I covered for my graduate thesis story. And, basically just the inequality there was astounding. And the American healthcare system in general is like, I don't understand the shit at all. Like, this doesn't work for anyone. So, for in terms of how I've become to identify myself, I always say, first and foremost, I am Japanese. And then, second, I am a global citizen. So I consider myself sort of like an international person. And then third, I say I am, a Japanese national living in America. And often people are kind of confused because, I don't really have a Japanese accent. And so they just assume that I'm from like California or something. And I'm pretty vehement to be like, no, I am not from California. No offense to anybody from California, but I am from Japan, raised there. So that's kind of the evolution of my own identity. As it pertains to how I think Japan is changing in terms of how it contends with the notion of identity. I think there's both positives and negatives. And you and I are speaking now before the 4th episode has been, uploaded to the website. But in the episode, essentially, I answer that question. But, the long and the short of it, without giving too much away, is that I think really the power of athletes like Naomi Osaka or celebrities like Ariana Miyamoto, right? And just the number of increasingly diverse half Japanese, half something else faces has really changed the Japanese public's opinion. Not that every single, Japanese person is like, oh yeah, like whatever, you're just half, that's fine. But I think the attitude, generally speaking, towards them is much less hostile than, like, I think the era that you and I grew up in Japan. And that was surprising to me because Japan, as you know, is a very conservative society. It's slow to change its sort of socio-cultural norms. And so in interviewing the people that we did, I was surprised by that. And just a shout out to Naomi Sundberg, class of ’08 at ASIJ. She makes an appearance as well. On the flip side of that, I also interviewed, his pseudonym is Makoto Sakurai, or Sakurai Makoto, right? He's commonly referred to as like the Andrew Breitbart of Japan. He has stoked a lot of right-wing sentiment and anti-foreigner sentiment. And the fact that, he started off just as some like 4chan like dude, but is now, he has his own political party, and he is trying to be a legitimate contender in politics, right? That is scary, but that is also happening. And especially, I think, when there are changing forces in Japan, more immigrants are coming in, despite the fact that they probably don't, have long-term visas or whatever it is. But those changes, I think, worry people. And that sentiment, that sort of counter sentiment, is also happening at the same time. But at the end of the day, my belief is that, well, much like in the US, it's inevitable, right? When you have a population decline as much as it has in Japan, like, what are your alternatives? And rather than being afraid of these people, like, help them out. And it's not like, this is a thing that people say in the US all the time too. It's like, it's not a zero-sum game. Like, just because you give more rights or give more help to immigrants doesn't mean that those rights are then taken away from the majoritarian people. So, like, what's the problem? But, all that to say, regardless, I think sentiment has very much changed since the time that you and I were in Japan. And that, to me, was like genuinely very surprising.
That's really unique what you mentioned about the athletes, because I noticed that too. Sunny Brown, the NBA player now called Rui Hachimura.
Oh, Rui's my man. Wizards.
Yeah, if someone told me 20 years ago there would be a Japanese player called Hachimura in the NBA, I'd be like, nah.
Exactly. NBA, I don't think so.
Not happening. But I think you make a great point that sort of these people that are in the spotlight, right? It makes a difference. And even with the news, my mother was telling me, there's a very popular announcer right now on television who's half Japanese, half white lady, who's on the news every night. So hopefully through these, people that have the spotlight, like Naomi Osaka definitely has a very bright spotlight on her, that will help sort of lead the way towards less, antagonism towards people who aren't pure Japanese.
Yeah, and, I will say, all right, just one thing on that. I will say, though, that I'm afraid that that kind of thing is sort of superficial. And I just hope that there's a bit more introspection among Japanese people. And I'm not really in a place where I can push this, but like, I hope that Japan will look a little bit deeper beyond, well, we can like Black people because we like Naomi Osaka, right? Like, that analogy to me is a little bit problematic. So hopefully there's, a little bit more introspection that happens, and it's more just, we're all humans. So like, let's not pick on people with just slightly different color skin than us, that kind of thing. But anyway.
Set questions. I have touched upon all things I wanted to. Is there anything that you would really want to put on air that we haven't touched upon?
Just as it regards to Deciphering Japan, I'm really, and I'm not saying this to try to like be like self-promoted, but it was a really great opportunity for me to be able to be a part of something that I think helped to change the narrative of how Japan is portrayed around the world. I often am just generally pretty disgusted or like pretty disappointed when I see TV shows of like, oh, like look at how weird Japan is. Like, let's go to this robot cafe. And like, yeah, like that's definitely part of Japan. But I think our series managed to sort of penetrate deeper into the surface and hopefully shed light on Japan in a way that, most Western sort of media outlets don't do. And this is aired for Singapore's national broadcaster. So the audience is sort of, non-Western in the first place. But I think we managed to do that. And, it was a real great opportunity for me, I think, to be able to do that, because it's so rare that you see Japan in the media where it's not sort of exoticized, so yeah, that's what I hope people get out of the show when they watch it, just to be able to see a different side of Japan that I think is closer to a more sort of authentic view. And of course, it's just my view, right? So I'm not purporting to say like this is everybody's view of Japan. And obviously, we try to be objective, but also with the understanding that as creators or as producers or as hosts, right, you're always going to be seeing the things through my lens and through the script's lens. So it's not completely objective, but all that to say, I hope, and I hope that even people who don't know Japan all that well will watch it too, so that they can sort of edify their understanding of Japan, and not just through like anime, which is a fine venue to be able to do that, but that's not all of what Japan has to offer. So that's all I'll say about the show.
I was wondering, how did it actually come about? When did this whole thing start? Was it you who initiated it, or is it someone else from the outside who contacted you?
Yeah, so it was kind of this crazy serendipitous experience where the moral of the story is keep your portfolio websites up to date, because I got an email, essentially what would have been last October, I think, from a production company saying like, hey, like we'd like you to audition for this show. It's called Deciphering Japan. It takes a look at Japan, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I don't know what this is. Like, I don't know who Peddling Pictures is. Like, ignore. And then, one of their researchers like reached out to me on Twitter. They're like, hey, like, did you see our email? Like, we've done other cool stuff in the past. And Deciphering is actually a part of a whole compendium of shows. So they've done Deciphering Philippines, Deciphering India, Deciphering Indonesia. And after Japan, I think they're going to do another Southeast Asian country. But so once I saw, those, I was like, oh, this is actually really, really compelling, and, reminded me a lot of the work that, Anthony Bourdain does or something like that. And so I was like, okay, so like these guys are serious. This is a legitimate thing. Why not? I'll just audition. Like, what do I have to do? Just a quick video. And, one thing led to another. And yeah, I was chosen as a finalist, which was, kind of crazy. I'd never, I'm usually like in your position, or like I'm usually the person behind the camera. So on camera work is stuff that I've not really done before. But I have a great sort of, coach for that. And he helped me a lot. And I think it also helped because I know, as someone who's usually behind the camera, I know what I want out of the person who's in front of the camera. So hopefully I think I was able to channel that a bit with the role reversal. But yeah, it was a great experience. And I think I was only able to do it so well because of my team too. Incidentally, the series director, she was also the one who wrote the script for the third and fourth episode. She is British Japanese. And we just discovered this when we were, talking, but she went to Nishimachi International School for a year. Yeah. When she was younger. So I was like, great minds.
Yes. Small world.
Yeah.
That's a great point though. Keep your online portfolios open. Is that specific in your industry? Like that there's sort of these, you mentioned even Twitter. Do people just sort of reach out to each other through looking at each other's portfolios, Twitter?
Yeah. Yeah. If you're, in journalism and you don't have Twitter, it's kind of like, well, how do you find people, or how do you, find your sources? Like, that's crazy. So yeah, usually, unfortunately, if you're a journalist, you have a Twitter. I think it's pretty typical too for people who do production work and maybe not just traditional journalism that they have portfolios of their work. Whenever, you're applying to anything, they ask you, show samples of your work. And a good way to show that is just, by having a website. So
that's crazy. So it started October. You guys it looks like it was winter when you did most of the recording.
Yeah. So this was mid-February to early April. So actually, this was just around the time that Japan was catching on with coronavirus. And so I feel like it was a miraculous experience that timing worked on our side and we were able to film everything and then get the hell out of there. And literally, I think the next day, Tokyo declared a state of emergency. And so we wouldn't, have been able to do everything. And I was on my way back to the US. I had to make like 3 layovers and I was like, dying. It was not a great experience. But yeah, I mean, we had luck and time on our side, and also just like fabulous researchers and what are called fixers. They're usually local journalists who already have, a lot of relationships with different people. So when we say, well, we need to find someone like X, like, can you try to help us find it? They did it. And yeah, I mean, a lot of this had to happen because, for the work episode, for example, we were supposed to go to this huge like shukatsu event, right? That happens every year where students go to, recruiting fairs essentially. And those were all canceled. So we were like, oh crap, like we have to like find a new way to tell this story. So it was a lot of, working on the fly. And we couldn't have done it without our fixers.
That's crazy. So that just worked out. I can't believe you were there all the way till April. So you must have just beat the I think they call it the emergency. I don't know what the English said. Kinkyu Jidai Sengen or something like that.
Yeah,
right?
state of emergency announcement. Yeah, literally, it was the next day after either after I left or after the director left. So.
Wow. So I like at the end to ask the guest what's happening in the next few years, next few decades. So if you can update us with what is next now that Deciphering Japan's over. I guess you still have your 20-something podcasts, but
well, it's a good I mean, it's a good question because I'm actually leaving that position in September. And so I honestly don't know what I'm going to do next. All I know is that, I had such a great experience with Deciphering Japan. And, after being in journalism for almost a decade, I guess at this point, my one revelation is that sometimes telling the truth is more compelling when you do it outside of the realm of hard news. So like, for example, I was really inspired after watching Chernobyl, the like fabulous HBO series, dramatized semi-fictional series about, the Chernobyl explosion. And I felt like the message of that show, which is, TLDR, like, the truth, if you tell a bunch of lies, the truth will eventually catch up with you. And like that message, which, resonates with the times that we're living in right now, more so than any news story that I ever read about, accountability or Trump or whatever it was, right? That Chernobyl show and that message of that show like stuck with me more. And so after sort of realizing that, I'm kind of hoping to get into a space where I can continue to tell stories as journalists do, but in a way I think that's a little bit different from, just like what happened yesterday and what does that mean for the world, but do it in a way maybe, that's through, like a prestige TV show or something, again, that's like outside of the news, but I don't know, who knows.
That's really cool. So you're up to going sort of beyond the nonfictions into the more like, I guess you could say entertainment, even if it's something that exposes truth. I mean, sort of a extension to that question would be, would you be open towards media that is just totally fiction then? Or is that sort of element of truth and like the element of reporting vital to part of the, the media that you're distributing?
Yeah, I mean, I think even when you're telling a fictional story, if part of it is rooted, or the message is somehow rooted in truth or reality, or what's happening, I think that's compelling. And some of the most, best fiction out there is probably, stuff that reveals a lot more about our world than nonfiction thing does. So, yeah, I'm definitely open to that. I'm not experienced in that space, but that's something that I'd really like to, try to penetrate. So if any alumni are out there who need a producer or a writer or anything, let me know.
That's really cool that you have various options. And yeah, I look forward to seeing episode 4, as well as seeing whatever episodes you do in the future in your career beyond Deciphering Japan. So thank you for being a guest today. And hopefully we'll get through this coronavirus thing. I know you are right in the midst of, you're in DC right now?
Yeah, I'm in Northern Virginia. Yeah. Yeah, it's not as bad as like Florida or one of these states, but not doing as great as it could do either. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But thanks for having me on. This is a really great podcast. There are few people, unless I think you went to an international school, who like get how great international schools are, or, some what the problems are and things. And I just like love talking to people in that space. So thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Definitely. Thank you for being a guest, and I'll see you around. Bye.
Sounds good.